Okay, welcome back. Moving right along, we're going to continue on our discussion of evil, the nature of evil here, with looking at a story now instead of a poem, Barn Burning by William Faulkner, which I think is one of my top 5 all-time favorite short stories because of the way it challenges me as a human being to think about the bigger questions, particularly the question of the nature of evil. And I've taught this story a lot of times over the years, and I've found that students usually have a strong reaction to it in different types of reactions, but there's typically 2 types of reactions, 2 ways to read it. More than that, but 2 most common ones that I get from students. So I'll be very curious to see what you think. And I framed the title of the lesson as Evil or Not in Barn Burning because what you interpreted of the 2 most common ways to interpret it, which one you choose, kind of automatically then answers the question of evil. So we'll see what I mean by that. And I included this picture. I want to just take a minute and look at the picture because I think that will help us as we go through the lecture and try to answer these questions and try to consider which of the 2 interpretations we agree with. I think this picture, we need to let it marinate and sink in. Okay, now that that's sunk in, let's come back to the big question. Like I said, Blake's poem really poses the question, what is the nature of evil? But we would talk about the question itself in more detail at the start of part 2. So, does evil exist? What you might be thinking right now is, do I even have to ask? And I already acknowledged at the start of part 1 that the answer is basically yes. So the question is more of, what do we do with it? But I want to add the caveat, well, in 2021, I think I do have to ask, does evil exist? And you'll see why on this next slide. So before we look at the author, William Faulkner, I want to give you some context for the question itself. Why do I even have to ask, does evil exist? And why is this question important? Here's kind of an opening hook, an example for you. I love the Marvel movies, the Marvel Cinematic Universe specifically. And so I am always looking up lists like best MCU villains. What are the best Marvel villains? And the last time I did this, most recently, I found something interesting. Eric Killmonger, who's played by Michael B. Jordan in the movie Black Panther, was number 1 on a lot of lists, in the top 3 on many lists, usually only because I looked at a dozen lists from different websites and bloggers. Usually, if anyone was ahead of him, it was only Thanos and Loki. Or if someone else did put someone else ahead of him, he was never out of the top 5. Always top 5 out of over 20 possible villains. So, to me, that's really interesting. I think that stands out for any character. To be that, highly thought of is unique. But it's also unique to me because in my own viewing experience, I really liked Killmonger. But I wouldn't have necessarily said this guy is the greatest villain in the MCU. So, makes me think. So I did a little more digging to think about that. And in one of the articles that had picked him as number 1, the author said this. This character, Killmonger, played by Jordan, is written so well, so emphatically, that it's weird to even call him a villain. It's easy to agree with Killmonger's motives to share Wakandan technology to help the oppressed people of African descent all over the world. And even though his methods are extreme, you see his point. How rare is it to be moved to tears by a film's antagonist? So, I agree with the statement, and these are the reasons why I did initially like Killmonger very, very much when I saw this film, but they're also the reasons why I wouldn't have picked him as the best villain. Because it says right here, it's weird to even call him a villain, right? I think I almost didn't think of him as a villain. So let's unpack this a little more. Hopefully I tried to pick a really familiar example for everyone to frame this question about the nature of evil. But if you haven't seen this, there's essentially a fictional African country called Wakanda that is light years ahead of like most of the rest of the world in technology, because this rare fictional element called vibranium is there that's made them very powerful. And uh, one of the native people, his nickname, his call sign, his villain name is Killmonger. Eric Killmonger. His family is originally from Wakanda, although he grew up in the U.S. in a poor African American community in Oakland because his father left Wakanda. But um, his argument is Wakanda has always hidden itself from the rest of the world, been very isolationist. He says we need to take this technology and spread it throughout the world to help people of African descent who are oppressed, like he was, all over the world. So we completely agree with that. But he's not just talking about sharing technology. He's talking about actually using weapons. And there's a part in the film where he takes over the throne from the Black Panther briefly, and he's ready to target all these weapons in various parts of the world. And so his methods are extreme, like the quote says. And so helping people, obviously a good thing. Killing people to do it, that's where we run into trouble. And so I love this movie. I love Killmonger. I agree with his vision. I don't necessarily agree with his methods. But the fact that he's the villain of the film is what's kind of troubling or unsettling to me, because it's a pattern. He's the best example, I think, but it's a pattern we're seeing more and more. If we're even calling him a villain, why is he the villain? Why isn't somebody else the villain? Contrast him, for instance, with the Joker. Not the Joker from the movie The Joker, but the Joker from the movie The Dark Knight, which came out about 13 years ago. If you've seen it, if you're not too young to have seen it, that is a crazy person who's just killing people for no reason. He gives different motives and makes up different stories, so you never truly know what his motives are, and that's part of the terror of the Joker in the 2008 film The Dark Knight. So you contrast that with Killmonger, where not only do we know his motives, they're incredibly sympathetic. You start to see the question I'm getting at here. But the reason I bring it up is I think we're starting to see more and more villains like Killmonger and fewer villains like the Joker. And if our villains are essentially heroes, or their motives are at least heroic, what does that mean about a culture's belief in the nature of evil? And that's why I have to say, does evil even exist? If Killmonger, who is weird to call him a villain, if that statement is in an article that rates him as the number one villain from this long-running franchise, then do we even believe evil exists as a culture? So I think I do actually have to ask the question, does evil exist in 2021? And I think barn burning asks that question. So with this kind of context in mind, let's turn in. So keep what I just said about Killmonger and his popularity in the back of your mind. We're just like shift gears for 2 or 3 minutes here and real quickly go over Faulkner's background, because like I said, I always like to just give you that little dose of what this person was like. So he's a prominent American writer during the period we call the modern period, a modernist. And from that group of writers who were writing in the early 20th century, he's arguably, some might disagree, so I say arguably, but one of the most influential and widely recognized American modernists, even to this day. He had what we would call posthumous literary recognition, but little financial success as a writer during his lifetime. So today, many people think of his books as great books, but he was pretty poor. They weren't, bestsellers, and he had to do things like write screenplays for Hollywood movies to get by during his life. All of his works, I think every single one that I can think of, is set in the southern part of the United States. And so that southern setting is incredibly important as it clearly is in this, immediately post-Civil War setting of barn burning. It's very important, but at the same time, while that's really specific and unique, I think he deals with these universal themes, like the nature of evil, that apply to everyone, even if we're not from the South. But that Southern setting made him part of a movement called the Southern Renaissance, which was in the middle of the 20th century, 1940s and 50s. Around that time, there was just a ton of novels and short stories being cranked out of the southern U.S. And the next lesson, we're going to study Flannery O'Connor. She would be another example from the Southern Renaissance period. Lots of writers just emerged from there during this time, I think, because it had been long enough since the Civil War and since Reconstruction that people were able to kind of look back and start to grapple with all of the things that had happened then and be able to write about them. It was recent enough, but there was just enough time that there was just this explosion of writing, and particularly fiction, particularly short stories. In his writing, Faulkner invented a fictional county called Yoknapatawpata, and it's this huge Mississippi county. And so what you have in his stories are recurring characters who live in Yoknapatawpata County, but show up in different multiple stories. So, for instance, the father in this story, Abner Snopes, the family's last name is Snopes. The Snopeses are a big, big family, and so different members of the Snopes family show up in all different of Faulkner's works. And that gives his canon, his set of novels and stories, its own rich history and mythology, which is a powerful thing if an author can create it, and it shows the power of his writing. And then obviously, this is head-stoppingly obvious, but it's important for me to mention, is the post-Civil War South. So hopefully you know a fair amount of this period from history and like taking history classes up to this point. So I'm not going to go over it in detail, but the Civil War and the outcome of it greatly transformed the South. Slavery ended, thank goodness. The end of slavery. There could have been a better or more important thing to happen. But the Southern economy had been so dependent on slavery. It was so entrenched in the economy of the South that it completely transformed the South. And the government had to make efforts to try to support the Southern economy, and those efforts were called Reconstruction. They often made things even worse. And so you had families and people who were once wealthy and prominent, falling from that position, in the society, complete upheaval in that society. And so Faulkner, the beauty of his writing is he deals with Reconstruction at all levels. He deals with characters like Abner Snopes who find no place for themselves in society after the Civil War. He deals with the aristocracy, the rich people who owned slaves, and more so than the slave owners, their descendants years later, who weren't really part of that, but are still experiencing the aftermath of Reconstruction. And then he has plenty of African American characters as well. So you see their perspective and really all the layers of post-Civil War Reconstructionist South in his works. And I think that's one of many reasons why he's such an important writer. So with a little bit of background on Faulkner, what are the themes or threads we're going to pull on here? Good versus evil, which is like a given, right? In a lecture where the question is, does evil exist? Sardi versus Abner, that's really the central conflict of the story. It's all based around that. And depending on what you think of each one, I kind of have Good and Sardi parallel there, but you could flip the two depending on what you think of each character. Individual versus community, because Abner frequently says things to him like, you've got to stick to your blood. And what we have at the end of the story is Sardi does not have a community anymore. He's completely cut off from everyone he's known. That's what he's given up at the end of the story. And that gives us a lot to think about. And finally, higher morality versus what I'm going to call tribal morality. You could call it family morality, clan morality, group morality, whatever you want. I think tribal is the word that is the broadest term there. But essentially the idea of we are a unit. You've got to stick to your own blood. Our morality is what matters versus a higher sense of morality. Abner is essentially, I'm paraphrasing here to be very clear and blunt, but Abner is basically saying to Sardi, when he says you've got to stick to your own blood, he says, if I burn barns and I'm your father, you have to support me. That would be tribal morality. Higher morality would be it's wrong to burn barns no matter what. And so it's essentially a story of conflicts, and we'll see how each of these conflicts plays out. With those threads in mind, the first question I'd like to ask you is, who is the protagonist of the story and who is the antagonist? That might seem very straightforward. I mean, what you're probably, I would guess, thinking right now as I ask the question is, well, Sardi is the protagonist. The story is mainly from his perspective. His fate, what happens to him at the end of the story, is the last thing we see and thus seems to be most important. Abner clearly seems to be like a villain. He's burning down barns. And I agree with that assessment. But I've taught this story a lot of times. I've had some really interesting conversations with students about this story who found that they thought Abner was actually the protagonist and Sardi the antagonist. And as an instructor, I prefer to be challenged by students. And I haven't changed my stance. I still personally think Sardi is the protagonist, but I appreciate the challenge because it's made me think of the story on a deeper level. And what it has done, what it has changed, is not what I think of the story, but how I teach the story. Because I never asked this question before. And now it's the first and not most important, but most fundamental question to ask with this story. You'll see why as I go through it here. So, how could we possibly see Abner as the protagonist? Well, remember back to lesson 1 and what we learned about narrative from Aristotle. In a narrative, you have the main character has a goal, that's the protagonist. If there were no antagonist, it would just be a boring story that would end quickly. So what the antagonist does, the purpose of the antagonist is try to prevent the main character from achieving their goal. When that happens, there's a conflict, and so there's action, and then there's the resolution of the action, how the conflict plays out, and then whether the protagonist achieves their goal or not, defeats the antagonist or not, and there's the resolution, the wrap up, the end of the story. And so Sardi has a goal, right? Trying to stop his father from burning the barn, trying to save the people. And Abner's clearly in the way of that. But Abner also, even more emphatically, or more clearly from the get-go, has a goal. He wants to burn barns of people he thinks are oppressing him. And so Sardi clearly could function as the antagonist then, getting in the way of that goal. Now let's take a look at some language from the story to support each reading. It's, like I said, a little more obvious how Sardi as the protagonist, but I still think it's worth taking time to see how. How is he the protagonist? Here's a great quote for that. Watching him, the boy remarked the absolutely undeviating course which his father held, and saw the stiff foot come squarely down in a pile of fresh droppings, where a horse had stood in the drive, and which his father could have avoided by a simple change of stride. So it's from Sardi's perspective, the boy remarked. I particularly focus on the use of the word stiff here. Abner is inflexible, and the word stiff is repeated lots of times. It's even in the next quote we're going to look at. And even more importantly is the phrase, could have avoided by a simple change of stride. So Abner's actions here are very intentional. Even if you try to make the argument that his burning of the barn is a response to the legal action taken by Despain takes that legal action because Abner's intentionally trying to antagonize him, to frustrate him, to annoy him by tracking manure all over his nice white rug. And so that intentionality to antagonize, to create, to generate conflict, to me, makes Abner pretty clearly the antagonist. But students have convinced me not that he is the antagonist, but that they can prove through evidence that one valid reading of the story is that he's the protagonist. So let's take a look at how they make that argument. Here's a quote that supports it. He stood for a moment, planted stiffly on the stiff foot, looking back at the house. Pretty and white, ain't it, he said. That's sweat. Maybe it ain't white enough yet to suit him. Maybe he wants to mix some white sweat with it. Before I talk about and unpack this quote and show how it could illustrate that Abner's the protagonist, I want to address the language here, which I also addressed on the discussion board assignment page. If you looked at the assignment page before reading it, hopefully you saw my note there. This story takes place at a time when this kind of racial slur was still regularly used by people. And Faulkner is trying to accurately depict the setting of his day. Now, does that mean Faulkner condones the use of this kind of language because he uses it in the story? A lot of people would say yes. They're wrong. That's the point of close reading, paying attention to detail, is to see what an author does with the content they put into their work. Now, I would argue that Faulkner is actually critiquing this kind of use of language. He depicts African Americans in complex, nuanced, humanizing ways all throughout his literary work, various novels, short stories, etc. I think he's very opposed to this kind of language, but by including it in this way, he makes us sick. He disgusts us. He wants us to have a disgusting reaction to this use of language so that we don't use it. And he can't achieve that effect. He can't thoroughly and fully critique or criticize this use of language unless he includes it in the story. Another really common example of that kind of a thing would be in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. So hopefully you're somewhat familiar with these kinds of arguments. But with that pointed out, let's get back to how this quote shows how some students interpret him as the protagonist. What I mean is that one reason students could interpret this passage as evidence that Abner is actually the protagonist is that he does something very clever here, where he equates himself with the African Americans in the story. He says maybe it ain't white enough yet to suit him. Maybe he wants to mix some white sweat with it. So you have this white house, this shining, very white house. It's oh so white. If you look at the language surrounding this particular quote, and he says, pretty and white, ain't it? Kind of like sarcastically. And that's sweat. This house has been made white, shining white, by the labor, the slave labor of African Americans. And Abner and his family, they're itinerant tenant farmers, so they travel around trying to get work. They tenants, they stay at a farm and they work on it for a while until they move on to another one. And so he's saying, now that we're here to work, because this is like their first day there, he's basically going to treat us like slaves, use us like slave labor. And so from that argument, you could see how some would argue, not all, some would argue that burning a barn might be an appropriate response to that kind of tyranny. And so I say people can make this kind of argument using this language. I think the story supports it. But as I've said all quarter long, there are no such thing as bad arguments, just poorly defended ones. So if you or someone uses this passage to make the argument that Abner's the protagonist, then it works. But the reasons why, even though I see it as valid, I'm not fully convinced are twofold. One, that, well, to explain the first one, I have to say that the only way the argument as Abner's protagonist works is if it's on a metaphorical level. if he may be like in his dialogue leveraging himself into a position similar to African Americans, I don't like that. I don't think anybody does. I don't think anybody who makes the argument he's the protagonist does like that. But what they're saying is Faulkner's doing it metaphorically through his narration, not Abner's dialogue, with the White House, the very White House. He's saying, that barn burning is an appropriate response to slavery. And anything to stop slavery is. Slavery has to be stopped at all costs. But I don't like making Abner the protagonist because I don't like him leveraging himself in this way. His experience is not the same as African Americans. He was not a slave. Even in the Civil War, which he really idealizes that time and his position in the culture of the South before the Civil War. So even in the Civil War, he wasn't like this loyal soldier. The story says he stole horses, he stole various things, he stole them from both sides. He didn't have loyalty, he was a thief. And so he has such little credibility as a character. I don't like, even if Faulkner's trying to do it to make a point about slavery, I don't like putting him in the same position as the African American characters. It feels wrong to me. But like I said, you can make that argument. So you've seen how Sardi could be the protagonist. You've seen how Abner could be the protagonist. The reason why this choice, which way you choose to interpret it, is important is, like I said, with the threads, we have four conflicts: good versus evil, Sardi versus Abner, individual versus community, higher morality versus tribal morality. How you resolve or answer the questions that arise from each of those conflicts hinges on whether Abner is the protagonist or Sardi is the protagonist. It's not the most important question, but it's the most fundamental question in that sense. Finally, I want to wrap up by giving you my second reason why I don't like seeing Abner as the protagonist, even though I think you can make that argument if you want to, and I will fully accept it if you prove it well. But the reason why I personally disagree with it is it comes back to our question of the nature of evil. I think there's a danger in saying something like barn burning, a crime that potentially kills people, is an acceptable response to oppression. I think we're saying that, what Abner is doing is okay because he's oppressed. And I struggle with that. I think that there could be other responses, but barn burning is not the right response. There's language in the story that describes Abner as the devil. There's whole articles that go into how Faulkner is depicting Abner as the devil. And so I think if we read him as the protagonist, which we can do, that reading is like saying evil doesn't exist. Abner's circumstances mitigate his crimes. And I think that is problematic. It comes back to my opening hook about Killmonger in our culture. I think evil does exist. And if we move too close to denying its existence, we run into trouble because we have to be on the outlook for it. Now, I think you can, through logic, through reasoning, through textual evidence, make the argument the other way. But I want to lay my cards on the table and tell you what I think. And be sure and be clear, because other professors don't do this, but I want to be sure and be clear. You can disagree with me, and I very much enjoy reading posts and papers that do, but that's where I land on it. So I want to look at one more quote, and then we'll move on to the discussion board questions. What do you think of Sardi's choice at the end of the story to sacrifice community for a higher sense of morality? Again, all four of the conflicts, all four of our threads revolve around this. If you believe Sardi's the protagonist, if you believe the moral good is more important than the tribal good, or that higher morality is universal morality is more important than tribal morality, he gives up a lot for it. He gives up everything for it. So even if you believe Sardi's the protagonist, even if you agree with his choice, even if you think what Abner's doing in burning barns is wrong, is the juice worth the squeeze? Because he gives up everything. He has no family. He has no community. He has no people anymore. Abner says you got to stick to your blood. Sardi doesn't, because he believes he needs to do something greater and more important. So he loses his blood. He loses his family. Last words of the story. He got up. He was a little stiff, but walking would cure that too, as it would the cold. And soon there would be the sun. He went on down the hill, toward the dark woods within which the liquid silver voices of the birds called unceasing, the rapid and urgent beating of the urgent inquiring heart of a late spring night. He did not look back. There's no turning back now. He's made his choice. He's betrayed his family for what he believes is the better good. And we may agree, but do we agree with the choice? Is the juice worth the squeeze? That's all I have to say about this one, because that's too good of a question for me to answer. Discussion board time. So the first question is the most fundamental, and I've already asked it. Barn burning offers itself up to be interpreted by readers in one of two ways, with either Sardi or Abner as the protagonist. Which do you see as the protagonist? What is your reasoning for this stance? So, here, what I have to say is this is the most fundamental question. So if you choose to answer one of the other three questions, you'll have to have already answered this. Why have it as its own question then? Well, whichever one you pick, if you choose to answer question 1, I'd like to see you defend it. So if you answer questions 2 through 4, you'll be operating from a premise that either Sardi or Abner, one of them, is the protagonist. But in those questions, you don't have to defend it. You have to defend whatever your answer to that question is. It's like a presupposition. Here, with this question, you would defend it. How do you see Sardi as the protagonist? How do you see Abner as the protagonist? I've given one example for each, but there are a lot more for each, even for Abner in the story. So this is where you have room and space to take that on. Now, in terms of the other conflicts in the story, in which one you see as the protagonist, here's another important question to answer. Readers often tend to interpret barn burning in one of two ways. Either one, Abner is evil, or at least his actions are evil, and Sardi makes a tremendous sacrifice for the greater good, or Abner is a sympathetic villain whose methods are extreme, but whose point we see, and Sardi thus makes the wrong choice. Which interpretation do you prefer? Why? So this one builds on the first question. The first question is more basic. Which one is the protagonist? But this question goes to a deeper level, right? Because if we accept that Abner is sympathetic, if he's not the devil, if he's not evil incarnate, then he's a sympathetic character whose methods are extreme, but whose point we see. I'm connecting this back to the Killmonger article there. And so, in that case, Sardi is wrong. And so, which way do you go? Basically going into more detail on the first question. Thirdly, in barn burning, Sardi and Abner have different views of morality. Sardi believes in universal morality, meaning he considers some actions to be immoral regardless of context. Barn burning is wrong even if Despain is a jerk who owns slaves. Whereas Abner believes in relative morality, meaning context and circumstances justify his extreme methods. How do these two differing examples help you reflect on your own beliefs and values in new and insightful ways? So I changed it up a bit here, because if I just said, which side do you take, or which one do you believe, I'd be basically having asked the same question 3 times. And I've already asked it the same question 2 times with questions 1 and 2. So I didn't want to ask it a third time the same way. So this question's a little more personal. And that's why I always give you choices. I would never make you have to answer a personal question. And this is a complicated story with complex views of morality, and it deals with race relations. So I'd ask, we're probably going to disagree about things when we interpret this story. as we've clearly seen, there's two ways to interpret it. And so I'd ask that you all be very respectful to each other in your discussion board comments. But seeing two views of morality here, universal morality versus relative morality, how does seeing it play out? Like, you've probably thought about this before, because our culture in the U.S. is moving more and more toward relative morality, even though we used to have more of a sense of universal morality in the U.S. So you've probably thought about this some, but seeing it play out, seeing it dramatized, seeing that picture of the barn burning on the opening slide, how does that make you think about this question of universal morality versus relative morality in more new and insightful ways than before? How has this story perhaps influenced your own thinking about where morality comes from? Does it come from you, yourself, your family, or does it come from something external and greater? Finally, at the end of barn burning, Sardi sacrifices membership in the only community which he has ever known for what he believes is the greater good. Do you think Sardi made the right choice? In other words, is the juice, the higher moral good, worth the sweet squeeze, giving up belonging to a community in this particular scenario? Why or why not? So that last slide from the close reading. Even if we think Sardi makes the right choice, even if we agree with his moral view, even if he's the protagonist, is it worth giving up his family? That is a hard question. As always, I'm really looking forward to your responses.